Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back, everyone, to this session. Kudos to all of you who've been attending all the sessions. Inshallah, we'll go ahead and get started. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ahli wa sahbihi ajma'een. We always start in the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, and may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon our dear beloved Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, al-Mustafa, the chosen one. And in this session, we are going to dive into the second part of the legacy of Islam in America with none other than our dear Dr. Bilal Ware. I've been blessed to hear Dr. Bilal actually the first time. A couple of years ago, I attended a conference in Anaheim, and he was talking about a book that he wrote, mashallah. And it was such an honor for me to just hear him and just see the depth of knowledge that he, inshallah, is going to be sharing with us today. The topic that we have at hand is a heavy topic. As we talk about the legacy of Islam in America, a lot of us come with an understanding, or misunderstanding, that Islam is something new in America. That's something that just happened in the last couple of years, or the post 9/11 era. And with a growing and diverse population, we know that the Muslim American community has been part of the fabric of America since before even its inception as a country. Recognizing that rich history and the strength of our community across the board, and the history and the shoulders of giants that we stand on, especially from our African American Muslim brothers and sisters, encourages us to really envision an inclusive America where all people are not only treated with dignity and respect, but for folks to belong as well. Our history of Muslims, of course, predates even the start of America as a country, but specifically here on this land in the United States, in the land that belongs to the Kumeyaay indigenous and other indigenous tribes. Over time, a land that has been stolen from the indigenous community, a land that has been built on the backs of stolen people, really just grounds us in our historic understanding of the legacy of Islam in America. So today we're going to dive a little bit deep into that, especially since the historical legacy of Muslims, as we said, dates back to even further than just the foundation of this country and its early expeditions. So many Muslims in America, like most others, either came here through as immigrants, as refugees, came here and were forced to be here as enslaved people by the white colonial powers to be, inshallah. But without any further ado, I really want us to kind of ground ourselves more on the 19th century, but also overall legacy of Islam in America, and recognizing that rich history. And Dr. Bilal, he's a historian of Africa and Islam. He earned his PhD in history in 2004 from the University of Pennsylvania, where he was trained in African history, African American history, and Islamic intellectual history. He is currently an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the founder and director of the Initiative for the Study of Race, Religion, and Revolution. His first book, The Walking Quran, the one that I was introduced to, subhanAllah, a couple of years ago, The Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge, and History in West Africa, it explores the history of 1,000 years of Quran schooling in the region. He is the author of multiple articles on Muslim anti-slavery movements in Africa and the Atlantic world, and his most recent book, Jihad of the Pen, explores Sufi thought in West Africa. So grab those notes and grab those pens, inshallah, because not only are you all going to be able to be given an opportunity to reflect, but there's going to be a lot of learning in this as well. So Dr. Bilal, please take it away.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyid al-Mursaleen, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. In the interest of time, I'm just going to jump right in. But I want to say just one kind of words of opening. Reflecting on the legacy of Islam in America, in the kind of historical longue durée, extending our view past the recent arrival, really post 1965, of significant numbers of Muslim migrants from many countries in the so-called Middle East, and in the Indian Ocean world more broadly. Um, Restoring the legacy of Islam in America prior to that period means restoring the role of African Americans in establishing Islam in these shores. It means paying attention to the history of Black Muslims and the fact that Black Muslims were here before the United States of America was here. And I'll just say as an opening to this conversation, that unless and until we as an American Muslim community embrace the past of our enslaved African Muslim ancestors, then we will be dismissed as something that is exogenous to America, something that is outside of America. Will be portrayed as foreigners and as somehow inauthentically American. But in order to counter that, we need to come to know the past of our enslaved African Muslim ancestors. And that means paying attention to Black people and paying attention to Africa in ways that the American Muslim community is frankly not used to. Because within our own community, we have a problem of anti-Black prejudice and anti-Black racism in our institutions. And this extends to also the view that we have of the past. So today's lecture, inshallah, should be an opportunity for us to reflect on the long presence of Islam embodied in Black persons in what become the United States of America. But it should also be a call to action, a call to solidarity with the Black community more broadly, because the struggle for liberation in this place has been one that has often been led by Black Muslims. So I'm going to begin today's presentation with a brief quotation, the words from one of those enslaved Muslims. This comes from a 19th century text called Pro-Slavery Interpretations of the Bible That Are Productive of Infidelity. It was arranged by an evangelical preacher who, before the Civil War, sought to develop the argument that Christian proselytizing, Christian preaching was not very effective in trying to bring Christianity to the enslaved, precisely because it was used so often to justify slavery. And in the work, he managed to capture an account of an enslaved Muslim man that was sold in the early part of the 19th century. And we'll have his experience in the back of our mind as we move through the talk. Here's the quote. In the year 1806, on the arrival of a slaver from the coast of Africa, John Doherty went to the city of Savannah to buy slaves. After several hundred had been sold in lots and single as suited the purchasers, a middle-aged man was put upon the stand who wished to make a communication before he was sold, the purport of which was that he was a Mohammedan, and that whenever the hour of prayer and other devotional duties came, he must have time to attend to them. Mr. D, who had lately embraced religion and seemed to be zealous to promote the cause, gave the highest price for him, feeling confident within himself that he would soon convert him to the true faith. Taking him to his plantation, he built him a hut and assured him that he should be allowed the time he required, and in addition should have every opportunity to attend all the meetings of the Christians. The Mohammedan slave for a while attended these meetings and learned something of Christianity, without, however, discontinuing his former devotions. At the expiration of about a year, his master, who was intent on his conversion, asked him formally if he did not prefer Christianity to Mohammedanism, and if he would not openly renounce the prophet and acknowledge Jesus Christ. The slave asked if the Christian religion allowed one Christian to hold another in slavery and their children after them. The answer, of course, was in the affirmative. The Mohammedan replied that the religion of the prophet did not allow that. The result of all was this slave, in a land of Bibles and gospel ministers, daily said his prayers, performed ablutions, made his prostrations, and in advanced age died, declaring that God was one God and Muhammad was his prophet. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was the moral courage. It was the commitment to liberty that was embodied in those enslaved Africans that brought Islam first to these shores. We know and can document without any ambiguity that as early as the 15 teens, there are significant numbers of enslaved Muslims in what is now Mexico City, the colony known at that time as New Spain. Muslims are, according to the best historical research on the subject, in the early part of the 16th century, for the period spanning between 1525 and 1575, Muslims account for roughly 60% of the enslaved population. This is 200 years before the American Declaration of Independence. We have Muslims in the Western Hemisphere, enslaved African Muslims. The documentation isn't as unambiguous, but it is very likely that Muslims from the Empire of Mali in West Africa reached the coast of South America in the 14th century, so that there was some kind of African Muslim presence that even predated the slave trade, although its historical impact is clearly less significant in the long term than the tens of millions of enslaved Africans that were brought through the trade. The best historical estimates by practicing historians nowadays will suggest that anywhere between 12 and 20 million enslaved Africans were brought from the African continent to bondage in New World societies. And it's important to recognize that Muslims, while there were very few places and times that were like Mexico City in the 1520s and 1530s, where Muslims were a majority, Muslims were often a plurality. In other words, they were the largest single group amongst the enslaved. People were taken from all over the African continent that spoke dozens, even hundreds of different languages, came from different ethnic backgrounds, and were all cast into a single repressive system of racialized slavery in the New World. But one of the things that was significant about Muslims particularly is that they already had an identity which transcended ethnic boundaries, which transcended linguistic boundaries, which transcended traditional custom. And if you take Muslims as a single identity group, they represent between 10 and 20% of all the enslaved people that are brought to the shores of the Americas over the 4+ centuries of the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade can be understood running basically between 1500 and 1888, when the last New World societies, Brazil and Cuba in 1886 and 1888, abolish slavery. And that's right, I just said 1888. We're talking about just a little over a century ago that slavery was ended here in the Western Hemisphere. There were Muslims being brought and enslaved, especially in places like Brazil, right up to that point in time. So enslaved Muslims made up a significant component of the overall enslaved population. And this is when, in order to understand where they're coming from, we need to turn our attention to Africa. We need to turn our attention to African history. The great American Muslim scholar, intellectual leader, thought leader, activist, Alhaj Malik Shabazz Malcolm X once said, "If a cat has kittens in an oven, you don't call them biscuits." And what he meant by that was, if Africans have descendants in the Americas, you don't call them Negroes, you don't call them Black, call them Africans. Those people that were brought here were carrying pieces of African history with them. They were living out Muslim histories here in the New World. And so the first part of tonight's talk is just going to be to quickly remind us that in order to understand where we come from as an American Muslim community, we need to pay attention to African history. We cannot behave as though the history of Africans in Islam is somehow tangential, somehow secondary, somehow unimportant. And yet, when we are in our public gatherings, we hear all about so-called caliphates. We hear all about North African history. We hear a lot about South Asian history, but African history is not something that we are particularly educated on. And this is unfortunate because when you're stretching from Senegal to Somalia on the far western portion of the African continent to the far eastern portion of the continent, you are engaging Muslim societies that have been part of the Ummah for 1,000 years. Islam is not some late recent arrival in African history. It has been integral to African history for at least 1,000 years. we need to be paying attention to Africa if we want to understand where the early American Muslims come from. This is something that just simply doesn't happen. We pretend as though Africa is not an important part of the story of Islam, when in point of fact, Africa is the only continent in the world that has a Muslim majority. There are more Muslims that live in sub-Saharan Africa than live in North Africa. There are more Muslims today in Nigeria than there are in Egypt. There are more Muslims today in Ethiopia than there are in Iraq. Islam has been a central part of African history for a long time, and it's about time that Muslims started paying attention to the critical role that Africa has played in the history of our religion. Just as Muslims, we need to be aware of this, but especially as American Muslims, because these are the progenitors of our own community. That enslaved man at the docks that day in 1806, and literally millions of enslaved people like him were bringing histories of Muslim identity and Muslim scholarship to these lands. In my first book that the sister just mentioned, The Walking Quran, I talk about the practices of literacy that have been central to Muslim identity formation and schooling in West Africa. In the 18th century, at the height of the transatlantic slave trade that is bringing people into bondage in this country, literacy rates in West Africa are actually significantly higher than they are in any part of Europe. They're higher than they are in almost any other part of the Muslim world as well, because basic Quran schooling is available both to children of free background, people of enslaved background, to male children, to female children. So literacy is widespread. And indeed, when you start to look at the history of early enslaved African Muslims in the New World, you find that there have been partial copies of the Quran, partial copies of Maliki legal texts, partial copies and sometimes whole copies of devotional texts that were written from memory by enslaved Africans while they were in bondage. In the 18 teens in Lima, Peru, there were functioning Quran schools in the slave barracks that was teaching Islam not just to the children of the Muslims, but to the children of the enslaved, whatever their background. So the history of Islam in the West is not just about the history of Islam in America, but the history of Islam throughout the Americas. Islam gets implanted throughout American societies, so it's inevitable that it's going to become part of the community here as well. And that is a really, really critical reminder to people that will tell you that Islam has nothing to do with the West. We were here before America was here. 1619, when colonists are arriving in what's now Virginia, there have already been Muslims present in the Western Hemisphere, even in what becomes the United States of America, because in Spanish Florida, there are enslaved Muslims that are present in the 16th century. There have been Muslims present even before the first British settlers arrive here. Don't ever let them tell you that you don't belong here. We're here before the Declaration of Independence is here. We're here before the Constitution is written. We are here and we're going to stay. So those practices of literacy in West Africa were part of a rich scholarly tradition that enslaved people were trying to keep active in slave barracks in spite of their bondage. There have been, as I mentioned, numerous surviving texts, copies of the Quran, legal texts, and other sorts of documents that have been written and preserved that were produced by enslaved African Muslims. One of them is a famous document called the Diary of Ben Ali, or Bilali's diary. I consulted it at an archive at the University of Georgia in Athens a number of years ago. Historians have written about this for some time, but this particular enslaved individual, and he was not alone in doing so, there were other male and female enslaved Muslims that left written text. He produced from memory a partial copy of the Risala of Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, one of the important Maliki teaching texts that taught the basic rules of ablution, the basic rules of prayer, the basic rites and rituals of the religion. And while he sometimes mistakes scenes for sheens in his writing, he is producing from memory a text that he learned as a child in West Africa more than 40 years prior to that. And he's producing it so that he can leave a document behind that will instruct his children on how to pray. Because this is one of the crucial things to understand about the enslaved American Muslim community, is that our religion was always under threat. Our religion was always under duress because we did not even own our own children. Our children could be taken away from us at any time. Reproduction of Islam as a coherent religious system was extremely hazardous, extremely difficult. And literacy, while it could be a distinction, could also nonetheless be a danger, because in all of the old South states before the Civil War, teaching enslaved people to read and write was illegal. Education was specifically denied to Black folks, precisely because there was an ideology which held that Africans were somehow subhuman, and also basically barely removed from the state of apes. The irony then that very Arabic literacy was sometimes used by plantation owners who were illiterate in any language, and sometimes used the writing skills of their enslaved African Muslims to keep their plantation records for them in Arabic. We have documented instances of this. So literacy could be a distinction for some enslaved people, but it was always a danger. And for Bilal Muhammad on Sapelo Island, off the coast of the Low Country in South Carolina and Georgia, it was a way of trying to leave to his descendants a trace of what his religious practice had been. Now, there's a lot more that could be said about this, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward because he's leaving that text in the early part of the 19th century. And I want to go forward now to the early part of the 20th century, because there's this narrative that with the arrival of movements like the Moorish Science Temple, with movements like the Fard Muhammad and what eventually becomes the Nation of Islam, that somehow new Muslim movements are arising in African American communities in the 1920s and 1930s. And it has been argued by some historians that these are, in essence, new movements, that Islam as a religion amongst the enslaved does not survive the institution of slavery itself. That there's the institution, there's Islam as practiced by the enslaved, and then there is something different that is 20th century Muslim history. And we have, a wide variety of sources that are now emerging to make it clear that you have not just Islamic movements like the Nation of Islam or the Moorish Science Temple, but the practice of Sunni and Shia Islam amongst Black Muslims in the 20s and 30s in cities like Detroit, in Chicago, and New York, and other places. But I want to disturb that narrative that there is this hard break between the Islam of the enslaved and the Islam of the 20th century, that there's a hard break between that man making an argument for freedom on a Savannah dock in 1806 and Malcolm X making arguments for freedom in 1960. Because as a historian, arguments from silence are always dangerous. The argument that Islam died out amongst the enslaved community really has been an argument that's been driven by a lack of sources, not by a set of documentary proofs. So I just want to read a quotation that comes from the early 1930s from a WPA narrative. The Works Progress Administration was one of the great achievements of Roosevelt's presidency. It was an effort to get Americans to work during the Great Depression, and it led to the creation of massive infrastructure, development in order to, develop roads and bridges. Lots of the roads and bridges that we drive on were built in that time. But it also tried to put to work out of work graduate students, academics, and aspiring scholars. And one of the things that the Works Progress Administration did in the 1930s was to go around and interview the last generation that had lived as enslaved persons. So slavery ends legally. We celebrate, Juneteenth. It ends. Word of it finally reaches, Texas. Word of the Emancipation Proclamation finally reaches Galveston, Texas, June 19th, 1865. At that point in time, basically every formerly enslaved Black person in this country is made aware of the fact that they have, that their so-called owners have no more legal right to them. So 1865 slavery ends. But in the 1930s, there are still, there's still a generation that had witnessed this institution as children. And I'm about to just read an account of one of the descendants of that same Bilali that left that copied out manual, that partial copy of the Risala of Kairawani, because it shows that 100 years after he had lived, his memory was still alive, and the memory of the practice of Islam was still alive amongst his descendants. Here's the quote. They used to say that Bilali and he wife Phoebe pray on the bead. They was very particular about the time they pray, and they very regular about the hour. When the sun come up, when it's straight overhead, and when it's set, that's the time they pray. They bow to the sun and have a little mat to kneel on. The beads is on a long string. Bilali, he pull a bead and he say, Bilambi Hakabara Muhammadu. Phoebe, she say, Ameen. Ameen. In the 1930s, the Islam that had been practiced amongst the enslaved community was still within the reach of living memory. It was still something that could be described to traveling white interviewers that came to remote parts of Tennessee and Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia in the height of segregation in this country. So I'll just ask a simple question. If you were a Black person living in the Deep South in the early 1930s and were being asked about the religious practices of your enslaved ancestors in an environment where there's basically no understanding of Islam of any kind, would you tell them that you were a practicing Muslim? It's entirely possible that the same formerly enslaved people that recounted the Islam of their parents, that recounted the Islam of their grandparents, were behaving the same way that their enslaved parents and grandparents had behaved, which means that they were going out into the woods and praying when no one was around to see it. We know from archaeological digs that especially in the low country of South Carolina and Georgia, often slave graveyards were oriented so that the bodies faced the east. Even the churches were often oriented so that they were facing the Qibla, because there was so much Islamic practice that was just hardwired into the religiosity of the enslaved community at that time. And all of this is simply to say that the culture of African Americans more broadly is infused with Islamic contents. We as a Muslim community have to acknowledge the presence of our African Muslim ancestors, even amongst people who do not currently share our religious identity. And I'll go one further than this. As a historian of West Africa, I can show you documented instances where shurafa, teachers that are descended from the Prophet Muhammad himself, are enslaved and sold into bondage at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. We know that there were Black shurafa that ended up on these shores. So the truth is that none of us knows when we encounter any African American, whether we are encountering a descendant of Muslims, whether we are even encountering a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad himself, peace be upon him. Some of y'all have had the good fortune of being able to preserve your lineages. We've had ours taken from us. So part of the call here is to recognize that if we want to claim as an American Muslim community, those African Muslim ancestors as our own, as co-religionists, we cannot separate them out from the Black community of which they are a part. And indeed, the success of 20th century Muslim movements, especially the nation, and especially the movement that Malcolm attempted to lead himself before he was violently taken from us, was that they were focused on providing real solutions to the problems of racial injustice in this place. Let's go back to that man on the Savannah dock in 1806 as we start to bring this talk to a close. He, in spite of the fact that he had had his freedom taken from him, was still projecting a narrative that was about a Muslim understanding of liberty, and that was about a critique of colonialism, slavery, and Christianity's complicity in it. Does the Christian religion allow one Christian to own another and their children after them? He asks. And this for him is sufficient proof of the injustice of the system, and he decides to stick with what he has. While some Muslim communities have argued in restrictive ways and have sought to assert control over people, the African Islamic tradition has been largely liberatory and emancipatory. When Malcolm and his like were struggling for racial justice in the middle of the 20th century, they were carrying forward the struggles of their enslaved Muslim ancestors from a century before, from 2 centuries before, from 3 centuries before. I mentioned those enslaved Muslims in New Spain, in what's now Mexico City, in the 1520s and 1530s. They were so known for fomenting slave rebellions that the Spanish crown, at multiple points in its history, tried to impose restrictions on importing Muslims in significant numbers into any Spanish colonies, because they were thought of as being particularly likely to rebel against the injustices of imperialism and of slavery. So where are we today as an American Muslim community? Have we earned the right to claim those Black Muslim freedom revolutionaries, those people that struggled for righteousness, those people that struggled to end oppression? Have we earned the right to claim them as our ancestors? Have we earned the right to claim them by our ancestors by honoring their biological kin amongst Black people? And have we earned the right to claim them by living up to the highest calls for social justice that Muslims articulated in Africa in the face of the slave trade, and that they articulated under the conditions of bondage in the New World? Unless we are fighting against the injustices and oppressions of our time the way that they struggled against the injustices and oppressions of their time, then we have no claim on them. And as long as we are participating in the oppression of their biological descendants, of Black people, then we have no claim to any historical legacy of any depth here. You don't get to count my ancestors unless you're part of liberating my people today. So that is the call that I'm bringing as I rep Imam Jihad Safir's shirt that he gave me when I came to Islah, LA on Crenshaw and Slauson. Stand with the Black people today. Live up to the true call of Islam, or prepare to be counted amongst the people of Pharaoh when the flood washes away the oppressors. This is the call that I offer alongside the historical narrative that is designed to educate us about the centrality of Islam to Africa and of Africa to Islam, and also the antiquity of the Muslim presence here in the New World. But in order to claim it, we have to make ourselves the measure of those who struggled for justice. Anything that was useful in anything that I had to say tonight came from God Most High. The deficiencies in it are from me alone, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Dr. Bilal Ware, may Allah bless you. I hope you took notes, because these are just not something for us to reflect on, for us to take action on. Something powerful that you said that I really just want to uplift and echo is, if you're not standing for the liberation of the Black community, then you do not have the right to claim to the legacy and the history. And that's just a bottom line. And so I know every time, I can go into depth in just explaining that statement, but you did a beautiful, fantastic job, because we know in our Muslim community there's that erasure of Islam in America, in our African American community. So when we talk about Islamophobia, and I'll pose the question, we talk about Islamophobia, folks point to 9/11, after 9/11, and the impact of the Patriot Act and what we're seeing happening today. And people don't realize racism and Islamophobia have been alive before this country became a country, right? Subhanallah. So I just kind of want to give you a time.
I'm happy to do so. I'll say one thing about the part that you underscored already, which is about not getting to claim Black Muslims when you don't stand with Black people. The most frustrating and now ubiquitous example of this is Malcolm. Malcolm is paraded about people's social media accounts, lionized by people who don't know anything about him, and would probably be mortified if they actually understood what his racial politics were, what his critique of capitalism actually was. He is now claimed as a kind of middle class icon for certain groups of Muslims, in the same kind of utterly hollow way that King is claimed by certain groups of white Americans. He's just there as a token, the substance completely removed. So that is that is deeply frustrating. On to the question of Islamophobia. I've often said this in public gatherings, is that Muslims in America don't have an Islamophobia problem. Muslims in America have a white supremacy problem that they refuse to identify as a white supremacy problem, because they don't like having to situate themselves in American racial politics. But there is a reason why the now outgoing president said, build a wall and ban the Muslims in the same breath. Because for him, those are just two different kinds of brown people that you want to keep out of America. The attack on Islam, while it may sometimes be phrased in terms that are specific about the religion, that is not the cause that's driving it, any more than what's driving, anti-Blackness is a critique of African traditional religions. Any ammunition that allows you to diminish non-white people is going to be used. And that comes in a variety of forms. And unfortunately, I feel like that simple reality that Muslims' primary problem is just an aspect of white supremacy. It's not its own thing. Islamophobia is just a subset underneath the broader problem of white supremacy. I think that largely has to do with the fact that post-1965, certain migrants from certain Muslim countries get to check the white box on their immigration forms. And that, frankly, has their heads all messed up because we can leave it at that. But the Muslims have a white supremacy problem. And if they identified it as such, then it would lead to greater capacity for collective resistance with other people of color. But if it's identified just as a kind of particularistic concern that is about religious identity, not only does it miss the mark, but it also leads to missed opportunities for solidarity.
Absolutely. Jazakumullah khair. And subhanAllah, think about this example that you gave in Dr. Bilal in terms of Malcolm X. When he was assassinated, they could not find a masjid. They could not find anyone to do the janazah. They could not find anyone to wash his body. So the very, communities that refused to wash, Malcolm X during his assassination when he was killed, you can't claim that legacy, like you said, unless you're living up to the legacy of what he was trying to build. And, just from what you mentioned right now, proximity to whiteness allows you to have this Eurocentric kind of viewpoint of history. In a way that, even when you say Middle East, middle to where?
Exactly.
Right?
No, that's exactly. But you'll notice I did say so-called Middle East. I'm not buying into that nonsense any more than you are, sister. No, absolutely. No, and it's absolutely true. And I mean, listen, one of the principal problems facing Muslims everywhere is that we need to decolonize the way that we approach our religion. We simply have not interrogated the way in which European imperialism and white supremacy has imposed itself on our very system of morals, our very system of ethics, the way in which we reason in the world. That also, frankly, comes with a critique of capitalism, which was something that was really, really important to not only Malcolm, but also to Dr. King for that matter, was understanding that the economic systems that we're embedded in are inherently unjust. That we need to struggle against them to create more equitable systems. Otherwise, we're participating in things that are fundamentally dehumanizing. And I mean, I've said this when I wanted to put a sharp point on it. But look, I come from a very poor background, impoverished background. My father had a 6th grade education. My mother was a teenage mother, pregnant at 15. I grew up in extreme conditions of poverty in the early part of my life. And from the standpoint of somebody who grew up the way that I did, when I look at the so-called mainstream American mosque, to me, their religion is capitalism. Islam is their ritual observance, right? The sunnah that matters the most is middle-class respectability, not the sunnah of the Messenger of God, alayhi afdal salatu wasalam, because the sunnah of the Messenger of God was to always bring his teaching and preaching to the lowest, the poorest, and the meekest in the society. And the prophetic methodology is to always start with the poor, always start with the impoverished, always start with the suffering, always start with the hungry. And we've still got a ways to go on that score.
Absolutely. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us for our shortcomings and help us up to being the ambassadors of our beloved Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. And I hope folks in the last 2 minutes of this session really just revisit the call to action that our dear Dr. Bilal Ware mentioned for us, because the legacy of Islam does not stop at the past. It's for what kind of space are we creating for future generations? What kind of Islam are we leaving behind for folks? Islam that really highlights the giants that we're standing on their shoulders, folks who we're able to enjoy a lot of the civil liberties and civil rights that we have today because of the sacrifice, because of the struggle, because of the resistance of our African American community. We trace the roots of Islam back. Folks, when I always think about our legacy, not necessarily just in the snapshot of America, but are also our historical Islamic legacy of being tied back to the prophets, back to folks alayhi salatu wasalam, back to folks like Maryam alayhi salam, back to folks like Dhul Qarnayn, and all the stories that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran. We have a rich history. We have a rich legacy. And when we separate out any aspect of that history, any aspect of that legacy, we're doing a disservice to ourselves and what we stand for as being ambassadors of our dear beloved Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. So take away from this session what you will, but bottom line is the struggle for liberation, the struggle to uphold this legacy that we're standing on continues. Either we are blessed to be part of that and we recognize it and we seize it so that future generations can never forget that, or we can sit on the sidelines as well, inshallah. So Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Bilal. Really appreciate you just coming on here and spitting facts for us. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Pleasure to be with you, sister. Thank you so much.
Jazakumullah khairan. And folks, check out the Walk in Quran. I remember I purchased it right after that session that I heard in you a few years ago, and it was just phenomenal. And folks, please continue to support our grassroots organization. Again, we're seeing this virtual gathering in a convention that usually folks are able to see family and friends and in a physical sense. And this time we're, because of the global pandemic that we're facing, we're calling in or tuning in from our homes, inshallah. So hope that you are benefiting from this. There are more sessions to come for today and tomorrow as well. Please go to masg.la/masscon20 to continue to support this work. Inshallah, jazakumullah khairan. Anything khair, anything good that we have said is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anything else is from our own shortcomings. May Allah forgive us. May Allah bless us to become that ummah that really recognizes its legacy, recognizes its history, and continues to act in that way. Jazakumullah khairan. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم.